get thus far in making it to this quarterfinal. I wish you the best of luck for this debate. I'll call the House to order and welcome the opening government team and the Prime Minister Speaker. Get here.
The US government has far too many agencies duplicating each other, doing almost nothing, costing an enormous amount of money, and making all of government inefficient. Starting with setup, the most important question in this debate is what is an agency? And we think it's distinct from two things. The first is it's distinct from the system of departments, that's things like Treasury, that's things like agriculture, that do the key functioning of the government. And the second thing it's distinct from is the truly independent commission. That looks like the Federal Election Commission, for instance, that have a separate structure with a series of appointed commissioners who have to be politically neutral. So we think this probably looks like the EPA, the FBI, the CIA, those kinds of government agencies. And we think those are probably the likely counterfactuals for where not yet. These are probably the likely counterfactuals for where the power is likely to go and where the funding is likely to go. I'll also note that this is, even though this is something that is currently being discussed by Musk and Ramaswamy, this is clearly not what this debate is about, given they have no actual power and now have seemingly pivoted to talking about H-1B visas for some reason. And also, this is clearly a multi-year long process, something that will take an incredibly long time. So it's not necessarily about Donald Trump or any particular president doing it in that process. Yeah.
All of these things that you describe are all federal agencies in the term and vernacular in which American politics discusses them. You do have to depend first to the Treasury or other departments.
No, the system of government departments is different to the system of government agencies, and the way that I know that is, obviously this is like a semi-open motion, but we have definitional fiat over what it means. And there's a set of things that use the word agency, and there's a set of things that don't use the word agency. So the set of things that use the word agency is at least reasonable, and your burden is to show my definition is entirely unreasonable, not just that yours is borderline better. The first argument I'm going to make is that this would save a substantial amount of money within the federal government. First of all, this is for reasons of duplication. That's to say both that different agencies are duplicating different direct services that they're renting, that's different regulatory services, that's different actual services to individual government users. But it's also duplication of administration. That's to say that you're duplicating the HR departments, you're duplicating all of the back-end functions, which costs an enormous amount of money. Secondly, you create an enormous amount of administrative frictions in the way that these agencies work, because they all clearly still need to work with each other, and that means you have an enormous amount of time waiting when the EPA is waiting for a response from the Department of the Interior, and that creates an enormous level of efficiency, and it costs money, not only because time is money, you need to spend time doing those things, but secondly, because you then have to hire lots of people to solve those administrative problems. An enormous amount of people in the US federal government are hired to be like the liaison from Treasury to whoever, or the liaison from the EPA to the Department of the Interior, and that costs an enormous amount of money. Thirdly, when you have too many agencies, they all try and expand their scope and you get bureaucratic empire building, and that is because they want more and more power, more and more prominence for themselves to be able to move up or move into the private sector. And when you have a large number of agencies, each with limited scope, they will fight over each other to grow that scope, which means it costs more and more money. Whereas when you are the Department of the Interior with full jurisdiction over the interior and all of the associated policy mechanisms, you don't need to. So you save money on that bureaucratic empire building. Why can they not just say, oh, we'll just simplify, we'll just be efficient in the way that we do the departments? First of all, what I'm describing is inherent features of the separation of these administrative functions. But secondly, it's often very hard to because people feel for their jobs a lot, and so there's not a huge drive for efficiency unless there is a big change, like massively taking down the scope and power of government agencies. So, what is the benefit of saving money? First of all, we can redeploy this money into welfare, into medical insurance, into doing good things. And secondly, the US government takes on less debt, which has to be paid back and means an increasing amount of your budget is spent financing that debt. And this is good for the private sector for the reason that it means they're no longer crowded out with higher interest rates. So, we save an enormous amount of money by simplifying the system. Secondly, why does the US government get far more efficient? The first, far more effective at what it can do. The frame for this is that creating a new agency to do a thing makes a political splash, even where it's not necessary. It will be more efficient just have your existing bodies do it, your existing departments. And that means that agencies have been massively overproduced. There was no reason the Department of Homeland Security needed to exist. Those functions already existed within government, but George Bush wanted to make a splash after 9/11. So instead of saying, oh, we're going to just have our existing agencies be able to do the things that we made the Department of Homeland Security, that still had to be an entirely new agency. Yeah.
So in your world, then they just create more departments, because if you're not expanding the scope and size of agencies, then you just build departments as they did.
The reason you're far less likely to create a whole new department is that it's a lot more legally and mechanistically difficult, rather than creating individual agencies, because it's incredibly normalized that you have a new agency all of the time, whereas the departmental system, the other problem with that is that it would grow the size of cabinet, which would make decision-making incredibly difficult, whereas when you appointed someone to be the director or administrator of an agency, they don't get the same cabinet position that they're called a secretary of the department would get. Why is it why is this unlikely that they will actually cut the power and scope of government? First, no administration in history has ever actually cut the scope of government. Secondly, these things are very popular. Even like the individual services that are done are incredibly popular. And thirdly, the bureaucrats would have an enormous amount of backlash to it. We can reduce the amount of bureaucrats through efficiency gains, but because it's a smaller reduction, that can just happen through the natural churn of labour in the federal government, so that people are less likely to lose their jobs, which means that we get better outcomes. Why does this make the government more efficient? First, it's cheaper, we can reinvest in things. Secondly, there's less coordination problems and efficiency, which means the government programs get done better. Thirdly, we get better incentives for government departments. First of all, they're now all focused on the purpose of the thing they're delivering rather than trying to fight against each other for jurisdiction over things. And secondly, it's better to internalize all of the things that you want to care about. So the Department of the Interior has to care about the environment and also has to care about progress and development, so they're able to do that trade-off themselves. Whereas the EPA making decisions about the environment isn't exposed to those other policy goals, so they're not able to do the trade-off. They will always maximally care about the environment, which is a worse heuristic. We should allow them to do those trade-offs. Fourthly, we streamline the system, because now you don't have to go for EPA approval and then Department of the Interior approval and jump around. You only have that one point of contact. You only have one set of approval that you need to get, which makes building and development more efficient. This also leads to more accountability. And the reason for that is that you can fire the head of a department when they do a bad job, fire the head of a department when they do a bad job. And as the government, you discharge that accountability because it's their fault. And people see the director of the FBI, who's supposed to be quasi-independent, very different to the person who's appointed to be the head of the Department of Justice, which is why it's much easier to discharge accountability by firing him than it is by firing the head of the Department of Justice. We also get better actual independence, because the problem with the agency system is that they're quasi-independent, but they're not really. They're appointed at will, they can be fired. Whereas if a set of things need to be truly independent, like the FEC is, it's better that they're made into actual commissions, which one, have more legal protections for their independence, secondly, have fixed term appointments, and thirdly, by law, have to have politically balanced benches of commissioners, which means that they can provide actually far better oversight. Finally, even if we do get some reduction in the amount of stuff that can be done by the federal government, this is probably the most ambitious set of policy that the federal government does that get cut, which often have damaging second-order effects. Things like low-income lending leads to the GFC. Things like the EPA being overly harsh on environmental development stops the development of clean energy. So if we lose the 10% most aggressive regulation, we say that's a benefit.
Thank you so much to the Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech, and I'm going to welcome the Leader of Opposition, the Open Opposition team. Yeah.
Big government is the worst form of government, except for all the others. There are two things I want to note about the OG. The first is that they don't prove very much. They prove perhaps that you save some money. They don't really show why that money will go to all of the good things OG suggests, and in many of the arguments, the links are incomplete. The second is that when it comes particularly to saving money, they actually don't contend with the fact that lots of these cost-saving measures give you more debt in the long run, right? That's exactly what happened with the NHS in the UK. You cut costs in the short term, which forces them to do low-quality measures which incur further costs in the long run, and thereby increase the costs on the federal government. 2 points of framing. The first is that many of these agencies are created by statute. This has two important effects. The first is the structure, scope, and size of these agencies is necessarily spelled out and limited by these statutes, and it doesn't bloat in the way that OG suggests. The second is that there was a very important case, a Supreme Court case last year, called Loper v. Raimondo, which said that natural language interpretations of statutes that create agencies are the only way that the powers of those agencies should be understood. That means it is impossible for agencies to give themselves more powers in the way that OG suggests. Finally, the US has a strong regime of judicial review, which means that even if agencies sometimes do excessive things, there are lots of ways to hold them to account. The second point of framing is how decisions are made within these agencies. Right? The unique feature of these agencies is that they have lots of expertise, right? They have leaders in their field whom they bring in. And the unique difference of OP is that you need to have higher salaries in these agencies to compete with the private sector. If you're giving people peanuts, then it's very unlikely that you attract the top talent, which means that the quality of regulation goes down on the government side when the quality of people you get is lower. I'm going to prove two things. First, that federal agencies only have the ability and incentive to solve coordination problems on our side, and second, that they're properly held to account. First, why do they only have the ability and incentive to solve coordination problems on our side? In the absence of any federal regulation whatsoever, the US states would resemble a state of nature, right? Constantly undercutting each other, driving each other to the bottom, and emitting lots of negative externalities. There are a few examples of this, right? Like pollution, where states want to undercut the environmental regulations that happen to each other. For example, if your pollution occurs in a river and the river leads downstream to another state, right, you don't incur the environmental harms of that pollution and it happens to someone else. It also occurs, for example, with excessive liberalization of business regulation, right? You want to undercut minimum wage or working hours or medical protections to compete with other states and bring investment more into your states because you don't incur the harms of that in the short term. It also looks like building crucial infrastructure, right? Maybe a flood wall needs to be built somewhere in the West Coast. No state wants to take on that burden, and therefore no state does it at all in the absence of regulation. The crucial difference is, why do you need significant funding to regulate these things? And therefore, why does it only exist in the world of OP? There are three main reasons. The first is that a lot of these projects are extremely costly. Right, so the examples I gave about building crucial infrastructure and regulation, if the states are not willing to do this, then the federal government needs a lot of money to do these things. The second, and more important, is a lot of the way in which the federal government convinces the states to do these important things is, unfortunately, through threats. So they threaten the state government and say, if you don't, for example, build this crucial piece of infrastructure or bring your environmental regulations in accordance with federal regulations, then we will cut funding to your projects or we will come down harder on particular kinds of regulation that you do. And that is only possible if the remit of those agencies is large to begin with. Right? The threat is not credible on the side of government if these federal agencies have already been significantly downsized. The third is that the way in which these federal agencies operate a lot of the time is that they sue on behalf of regular people. Right? So a federal citizen of the US has been affected by a particular piece of state legislation or other harm, and the federal government, through the Department of Justice or other things, sues on behalf of them with help from these agencies. Obviously, these suits require a significant amount of money in order to fight and win, either because they're competing with states, which are also significantly funded, or because they're competing with private business. And therefore, it is true that you need significant funding on our side for the federal government to do all of the good things that we want. Why is it that the federal government, therefore, will do these things? Like, what are the incentives of them to do so? There are two, mainly. The first is that these bureaucrats ultimately answer to politicians, right? And politicians have an incentive to solve these coordination problems because they exist at a national level, and these national coordination problems are blamed on them by voters insofar as they continue not to be solved. The second is that this is specifically what bureaucrats take credit for, right? Bureaucrats don't have political careers. Their only career success comes through solving precisely the kind of coordination problems for which their agencies have been set up. This is the way, for example, they can get promoted. Or if they want future political careers, this is what voters will put on their track record. And therefore, there is a significant incentive for regulators to do these good things and solve these coordination problems on our side. What are the impacts of this? First, there are huge impacts when it comes to these kinds of negative externalities, right? OG's world is one in which pollution is dumped into rivers because no state can be bothered to clean it up. But even if that's not the case, there's a crucial benefit of consistency that we get on our side of the house, where investors know there is one regulatory regime that operates across the whole of the US when it comes to the vast majority of issues, rather than a patchwork of state regimes as on their side. That's important, because what investors prize above all else is consistency and the ability to do business everywhere. Note that OG's policy takes place tomorrow, and the kind of investor shock you're going to get when you immediately gut all these federal agencies is likely to be significant, and it looks like businesses shuttering. Before we move on, is there closing? Okay.
I think we might not do all of this tomorrow. We might give it actually quite a gradual process.
Right, but even if you do that, the signal that you give that you're going to do this in the long run, A, saps existing confidence in the agencies that are currently set up, because people don't want to deal with them insofar as they know they're going to be gutted in the future, and B, sends a strong signal to investors in precisely the way that I've outlined. Second, why is it true that federal agencies are properly held to account? And here I clash with a lot of what OG says about the bad incentives of these agencies. There are three main reasons why this is true. The first is interagency competition. We agree with OG to some extent that there is some overlap between the roles and responsibilities of different agencies. That's a good thing, because these agencies want to compete to regulate and fund these projects in the best possible way, because that is the way they expand the budget for their agency as opposed to others. So the fact that there are multiple agencies with overlapping responsibilities is not necessarily bad. Second, there are appropriations committees which fund these agencies, right? The way that these agencies get funding is that there's an appropriations committee that sits on, for example, environmental regulation and business regulation, and the politicians on those committees are hesitant to always increase funding in the way that OG describes. First, because significant numbers of those people are Republicans and they're hesitant to federal government increases in spending anyway. And second, the primary way you finance this is through increases in taxes, which obviously these politicians don't want to have. The third mechanism is that there is an antagonistic relationship with the states in the world of law, right? Which is that federal regulating agencies often regulate the actions of states, which states don't always like, and there's a kind of antagonistic relationship there. Therefore, if there is overreach on the part of agencies into state affairs, there is likely to be significant pushback from the states. That's important because these states are often major contributors to national politics. For example, they're party chairs of important parties, or they make up a significant caucus when it comes to the incumbent president or incumbent speaker. That means there is a significant incentive for federal agencies to be responsible in the way they regulate and not profligate in the way that OG suggests. The strategic impact of this is that we don't get all of the harms that OG suggests, but in their world, these agencies are gutted and unable to solve all these problems. For all these reasons, opposed.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition Speaker for that final speech, and now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to close with the case of the open government. Yeah. Test the minutes of body, so quick as you can, please.
Firstly, on coordination and efficiency. Secondly, on why you should weigh efficiency highly. And then finally, reasons why even if some capacity is lost, that's a net benefit for the American people. Firstly, on coordination and efficiency, I think the misnomer, or I guess the problem with the vast majority of that case is, the assumption is that the removal of government agencies leads to less funding to the set of things that government agencies are trying to solve. I think that's a pretty ridiculous claim. Firstly, and quite obviously, there's the same political impetus on either side for that set of problems to be solved, which is to say the set of things governments fund are contingent on what political mandate they have when they come into power, and that doesn't change on either side. That implies two things. It implies, firstly, to the extent there's impetus politically to try and solve environmental problems or to try and solve other issues, that will still exist. Money will likely therefore be rechanneled into the set of departments that we explain often have responsibility overlap with these agencies. For example, where there is political impetus to solve environmental problems, the Department of the Interior replaces the set of things that are being done by the Department of by the EPA, which we explain is a better form as Matt's speech that I will not repeat. But secondly, I would point out that the second problem with this, I guess, is that this is just an explanation of why things are better concentrated within existing departments, right? Because if you believe that previous analysis and everything else we've already explained, what you should understand then is when you reduce administrative overlap, and you no longer have departments or agencies that are doing the same set of things, and as well as that, agencies that are doing the same thing as other agencies, costs don't go, or the amount of money you have to solve problems doesn't go down. The amount of money you have to solve problems goes up, because the variety of other things government spends money on no longer exist. Things we explain that look like a small scale, things like HR departments, but there's a huge amount of other money that government agencies duplicate infrastructure into. That is like, for example, prior to the public release of reports, agencies often invest huge amounts of money in research on both sides, and secondly and importantly, the higher level expertise that agencies have often gets duplicated in extremely inefficient ways. As this team observes, it is very expensive to hire people and compete with the private sector to get the best intelligence, to get the best research, to get the best decision making. If multiple agencies are both competing with each other for that expertise, such that some agencies are deprived of expertise because they don't have the requisite funding to attract them, but also all agencies are spending more money and therefore able to less attract them, you get a lot less efficiency occurring in government. Secondly, we explain, I think then just to repeat, a series of reasons why concentrated in departments is better. Because you might say, well, we're not explaining an efficiency gain then, if we're just redirecting who's trying to do it. We haven't explained why that's better. We explain that larger departments, firstly, care about the bigger picture in a way that is better able to coordinate those varieties of issues. For example, if you're responsible for both the development of cities and the development of infrastructure and also the impacts on the environment, you need to weigh those two things against each other. It's important because a lot of the competition that they describe is counterproductive towards solving problems. For example, the EPA, in order to make itself seem important, needs to be doing things, which means imposing regulations and preventing things from happening, because that's its job. To be an agency that protects the environment, needs to be doing some kind of policy. Whereas the department or other departments or other agencies in the government need to be showing that they're building infrastructure, which forces agencies to conflict with each other and do operations that cancel each other out when they try and demonstrate that the thing they're doing is most important and that they're getting the most done. Departments are much more efficient at that because they don't have that same incentive to shoot themselves in the foot. But secondly, them being large also makes the funding substantially more stable. Because the thing we don't get a response to from that team is the fact that these agencies, as I mentioned in the start of my speech, have fluctuating levels of funding year on year, depending on what political mandates exist. When these departments, agencies, are much smaller, it becomes much more likely that the individual agency gets its funding cut. For example, when environmental protection becomes less popular, you get huge funding cuts towards that. And that makes the net level of funding that they have in order to maintain their infrastructure, to keep people employed, to keep the best expertise, and to maintain the research they've already started, they now have to operate, even in years of high funding, at a lower scale, so that they know they can maintain the things that we're doing. That they're doing, but also often realize that they have to cut things that they've already just started doing when, for example, a different person gets appointed to that and then all of that ends up being cut. So having this huge level of duplication with individual bodies that have less stable funding, that are less able to essentially manage which projects are going to last for the long term and which projects are going to be short term, leads to projects that are worse and leads to projects that are substantially more inefficient. Their claim is that this duplication is actually good because it allows these different agencies to compete with each other, which is both a pressure for them to show that different issues are important, but also a pressure for them to operate better. Firstly, I would observe that departments have a variety of highly effective accountability measures on them. For example, there's a huge degree of oversight with individual departments. There's obviously a large degree from executive administrations in order to make sure departments are doing their job well, because those are the things that they're most democratically accountable for. But also departments often have individual figureheads who are in cabinet who are responsible for those things. And those people have their own political careers to worry about, which means that they have a strong incentive to manage their departments in a way that is highly effective, in a way that often the heads of agencies do not. But secondly, the way that money is appropriated to different agencies is often highly politicized, and therefore the way that competition occurs isn't in the direction of better policy or better action. It's often in the opposite direction towards who's most close to the party in power. It's often done in Congress by oversight committees that have a huge degree of politicization, and that means that that isn't necessarily in a way that leads to being better. The final specific claim that I want to respond to is the claim that when it's created by statute, so they're not able to get themselves more power. Firstly, I think this is an explanation of why you get a lot of duplication. Like if it's hard to expand the scope of one agency, it's often why new agencies are created when an existing agency could have done that job or an existing department could have done that job. Secondly, statutes can obviously be changed, which allows that to expand. But thirdly, the limitations of these statutes are not as absolute as this team claims. For example, it's very unclear how you would specifically describe exclusively what something was responsible for. That just sounds like it would remove all flexibility that the agency had to find and discover new problems, which would be a harm if it existed. Far more reasonably, they do have some scope to change the sets of issues that they're trying to solve, which leads to that. But before I move on, I'll take a peel.
If there are these just massive Frankenstein departments, won't you just create sub-departments within it, which parallel all of the problems that you create about internal divides, frictions, etc.?
Well, there aren't massive Frankenstein agencies per se, but it's not like there's massive Frankenstein departments on our side. Those, first of all, sub-departments within departments are far more able to coordinate because they're essentially accountable to the same set of people, which is potentially better. But secondly, you often have dynamic departments, sub-departments. So you have like areas that are responsible for research across the department, which enables them to not have duplication over who's doing that research or who's that level of expertise. But also the central management is the important part where you have the most important executive decisions being made, and that's the part that doesn't get duplicated even when you have sub-departments. Why should we weigh efficiently extremely highly? What I want to observe is all of our mechanisms for impacts of the cost trade-off and the efficiency trade-off are defining features of whether you achieve success. We explain cost as a trade-off to solving other things. It means less money can be spent on helping people in important ways. Secondly, we explain that lower cost means more can be done with the same amount of money, which means we get more and better experts, more research, more money to actually help people on the ground. Thirdly, we explain that agencies can be run better when funding is cut. So when funding goes down, because they're running more efficiently, that hurts them less. And fourthly, that the US government doesn't end up in more debt. That's when you should rate extremely highly. They said the money might not be redeployed well, but the things that help people the most get them the biggest political wins, things like welfare that we explain, or helping out people on the ground with good policy. I don't think it's clear why the American government has a disincentive new policy that is effective. Even if some capacity is lost, state government closes the ground, and less regulation can be good. As we explain that. Very good.
I'd like to thank the GPM speaker for their fine speech, and I welcome the general to close out the opening talk. Ready?
I want to note how extremely high burden and frankly silly the case to get from open government is. Because we live in a world that keeps getting more complicated. We're getting more and more new issues as you get faster and faster market behavior and new technology and new problems that constantly have to be solved. And what they would have you believe is that the services that provide things like benefits to a third of Americans or maintain fundamental services like healthcare or infrastructure ought to be accessed for a nebulous political benefit or for somehow spending this money better. I immediately want to flag that the definition in OG is bizarre. If they're right, the efficiency gains they describe simply don't happen because they never explain to you why politicians know how to manage those departments. I don't know why I should want to have someone who is a political figure in charge of those places, or why indeed, even if they have the right incentives, they actually have the ability to solve this issue. But also secondly, presumably the overlap and the infighting they discuss gets even worse when you put more people in the American cabinet. That is exactly when you have different politicians fighting and vying for control. Because they would posit that going into politics means that you are someone who wants this power, as opposed to merely being a bureaucrat in charge of a department. But also thirdly, counterfactually, they're very unlikely to keep this money on their side of the house. All they say is that you still want to solve these issues. But note that the reason they say that things become worse is because you misspend this money. Crucially, when money is more misspent on their side, that is when you don't see the justification to apply those taxes. That is when you have far less of a political incentive for those solutions. Their burden in this debate is probably to stand by downsizing government, but I will take them at their best and explain why we win, even under their definition. Let's go through their case line by line and explain why it is that we beat them. Firstly, on coordination and efficiency. I want to know how scant the analysis is and how contradictory it is in OG as to why this is an issue. Firstly, I just don't know why you see these duplications. At best, they just say that you have different bureaucrats who basically want to compete with each other and get this power. But the thing is, if OG is right and bureaucrats are in the business of empire building, I simply don't know why you would allow a different department to do the same job as you do. If anything, exactly because you want to have as much control as you can over your domain, basically, you're far more likely to basically not allow other such departments to exist or to waste the money in this way. However, it's also false when they say that you want to seem important as a bureaucrat. The thing is that your legitimacy is undermined if you're seen as misspending this money, and this is precisely when you're most likely to be removed from your position. Therefore, I think it's false that you see this duplication. The thing then is, they just say, you have HR departments. Why is HR bad? Presumably the size of the department scales with the size of the agency. And if anything, those services are useful. I think that even if duplication exists, it's very, very small, but also they never explain why you don't see the same duplication on their side of the house. But also, I just don't think it's true that it's easy or cheap to fund a new agency. You have to convince the majority, if not an expanded majority of the Senate to fund it. But also, it's often the case that it takes lots of time for the new agency to go online. Therefore, it's almost always easier to tack it under an existing agency rather than needlessly expand the government. Therefore, it's flatly false that you're going to hire a bunch of people who don't do anything useful. It's also false that you cannot fire bureaucrats. They just lie when they say that the government has never seen downsizing. This has happened before, be it in the Bush or the Reagan administration. But also, I would flag that the very easy way in which you can downsize an agency is by not increasing the funding they get from year to year. That is, you let them fall behind inflation, and therefore it's very easy to downsize even if you don't cut existing funding. At this point then, I think you should think it's flatly false that you see this inefficiency, or even if you think it's true, I don't don't think that it's any different. Why is it then that we still outweigh this, even if it's true? The first one is that the money they're saying they're losing often comes from the richest Americans. Therefore, I just don't think it's the case that it matters if you have to pay marginally higher taxes or do more of this borrowing. But also secondly, I think that this money is far more wasted on their side. And therefore, when this waste does happen, you're losing benefits from the people who need them from the government. Therefore, you should err on the side of caution. They never prove to you why they're able to strike the right balance between state power and federal power, and therefore you should err on the side that protects those who are the most vulnerable. But also thirdly, the problem on their side is that private interests become too powerful. That is, when you're far more dependent on those taxes, when you're far more dependent on like states to carry out these regulations, that is when it's far easier for companies to do the lobbying that basically misincentivizes the government or those politicians. Therefore, this means that things become far worse, and even if you have the right values, you lack the technical expertise, and that is precisely when mistakes happen. The last thing I want to prove then is why it is that you win the clash on accountability, which means that these departments basically achieve the results. We think that it's generally a good thing to have bureaucrats in charge while reporting to politicians. Why is it horrible to have a politician? The first reason is just simply lack the expertise. Like the cabinet appointee is often someone who hasn't worked in that department, and therefore they're far worse at managing it. But also secondly, when the department head is term limited, when you go to the president, that is when you're far less long-termist to the policies that you pass. That is when money wastage happens. That is when things become far worse from administration to administration. Next up then, why are quasi-independent agencies the best form for this sort of work under OG's definition? Firstly, they allow revisionism in the scope of the work they have. When you have a commission like the FTC, it is far more difficult to control the work they do or give them new remits exactly because you have to work through legislation as opposed to having direct oversight. Secondly, you have a higher degree of deference for quasi-independent agencies versus departments. There's less unlawful political meddling as it is the case within departments. And crucially, there is very little accountability exactly because it's difficult to regulate the communications of a department head and the bureaucrats compared to having more formalized channels between agencies and politicians. Therefore, we are the side that is able to unearth those scandals, and there's a very high burden to even firing the head of the FBI, for example. Closing.
It sounds to me like auditing is something that's in the incentive of not only private companies, but the majority of government departments. I'm not sure why this is what's getting cut as opposed to some of the things that the government's fairly identified.
So I don't think it's the case that you have the incentives to make those departments very productive in terms of what they do. Like I think there's a trivial trade-off whereby the more regulations you impose on things like the environment or unemployment, the more money it is that those companies are losing, and therefore it's even more difficult for the politicians to justify keeping those departments around. Why is it then that we are far better at holding those federal agencies to account in their size and their power? Therefore, and if you believe this, it's false that we're overspending on them. The first reason is we have like specific committees, as Taji explains, to which you get no response. Additionally though, it is the case that you have like an antagonistic relationship between both the states and the agencies themselves. That is, you don't want someone else to get more money because it's more difficult for you to justify this money. But also, at the point when you have like hawkish politicians who are like going to be very hesitant to give you an extra dime, that is precisely when the sizes are generally kept low. Therefore, given that and the point we proved to you about size, like legal scrutiny under like the very strong judicial regime, is the reason why those agencies stay small. At the end of top half, the question here is very simple. Who do you believe? Do you think it's correct that politicians are going to manage these agencies well, or is it good to have bureaucrats in charge of those departments? We proved to you why separation is necessary for accountability. We proved to you how we achieve those goals, and for all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition speaking in that fine speech, and now welcome the Member of Government Speaker, Joseph Hunt.
Everyone good?
Sorry to any kids watching this.
Fuck the government. The market's going to solve and is going to do an amazing job of doing so. We're going to explain something very simple to you. The crowding out of the private sector is the most damaging thing that happens by the overreach of agencies. We think that that is far more important than saving money, and we think it does a far better job of ensuring the best provision of services for the people. And here comes the problem with opening government. It's unclear how much money firstly goes to the programs that they want, as opposed to just like opening other new departments, as Owen points out. The private sector, however, always has to spend money on its provision and product. Whenever you scale up, you have to provide to more people and cheaper. And if it is much better, then we get every benefit OG does of saving money at much broader scale. But secondly, opening government just says it goes to departments, but they're not clear ever what is better about those departments. Many of their mechanisms are actually symmetric to departments. Frequency, fighting to try and go and expand their scale. All of these things seem to be as true as departments as they do of, for example, agencies. We're going to be able to show you why private markets are uniquely better at addressing the failures of government agencies by showing that it crowds out the private market does a great job providing services, and the alternative we prove is far, far better than the whimsical alternative that opening government decided to defend. Let's start by explaining why government agency expansion crowds out the private market in two crucial ways. Firstly, it is true that the more agencies we have and the more they expand their scope, the more they're going to need to spend money by taking up more debt. And the more it is that there's political or incentive within governments to expand the number of these agencies, the more debt they're going to need to take out. Now the Prime Minister says these words, private market crowds out interest rates, without explaining why they're crowded out or why the lending to the US is unique in its way. This is remarkable blippiness from this Prime Minister. Why is this actually true then? When the US does something, it needs to borrow by either issuing a bond or taking a loan or issuing a bond. That is bad because the US government is seen as the most stable repayer. Treasury bonds are seen as incredibly stable and never going to default. So it is the case that you will almost always take a US Treasury bond over bonds that come from literally any other private provider. This means then that it makes debt more expensive for others. Obviously there's a limited supply of people who wish to take debt from the market, so then it is true that there will be a limited supply to the cost. Interest goes up, making it harder to get those loans. Why is that bad? Businesses operate on tight margins. They need lots of money to scale things up, building new factories, and there are many risks that they have to price in. Things like the stock that they need to purchase, the amount of people that they're hiring, where there's plausibility of them failing that is reasonably big and dangerous for them. So the increase in interest rates makes a tangible difference to the risk calculus that they have and restricts their expansion where government's agencies expand. And this scales up. The more government agencies expand, the less private industry has the capacity to do so. And this is a remarkably broad mechanism because across every single department, whether good, whether bad, whether corrupt, whether not, it is still going to be true that it is going to crowd out the private sector's operation. But secondly, the state picks winners, but scares off private actors from involvement because they're scared that the government is going to benefit itself. It fears things like favorable regulation relaxes in favor of it, favorable contracts to contractors, which will then crowd out things for other contractors for doing things like building trains, because they think that stable payments will come from the government, who will never default on the payments that they provide. Or they just fear that the government could tomorrow choose to knock them out by outlawing their operation. And this doesn't need to be true that this happens, right? It is the fear itself that crowds out private operation, which the government never enters. Look at Brightline, for example, our private train company in Florida. They're doing an amazing job of providing high-speed rail, but they needed to wait for 5 different government changes on a state and national level before they could enter, because the government continued to crowd them out by adding more and more agency obstruction, by choosing public provision instead. It scares them off and means otherwise where services could do better by the private sector, it fails because the government is deeply involved. I want to weigh this argument against what we get from opening government. It is taking opening opposition far more charitably, because even if the agencies themselves behave well, spending is in and of itself going to be a harm. So independent of the opening opposition analysis, our harm remains true. Why is the alternative a robustly competitive private sector, and why will it be well regulated? Firstly, I think we still have things like robust antitrust, and as private sectors perform better, there's a greater incentive for there to be strong regulation, because companies themselves are likely to support and lobby for it. Why? They never want another firm to be able to gain a unique advantage, so they'll support these things in their growth. Secondly, without this crowding out, obviously more companies are willing to enter the market, which boosts the degree of competition, where they have to try to compete against one another for customers, which ends up reducing prices as they're trying to appeal to them. But thirdly, why is regulation itself likely to be effective? When less money goes to departments, more of it can go to keeping up with industries. For example, in tech very much, you struggle to keep up with industries who move fast, and you can't keep up with their hardware, for example, to analyze things like neural networks as they develop. Now you have the money to do that and scale up that provision, where you scale it back from the provision of it to a remarkably large number of agencies. And secondly, this is where we are able to get rid of regulatory capture. Agency obstruction actually matters here as compared to where opening government says it does matter, but it isn't clear how much it matters other than just people butting heads, right? It matters because you can capture a department through a revolving door effect, when it is that people within one department want to get jobs in the private sector later on, and therefore they're likely to be lax in the regulations that they do. But when there are fewer agencies, the government itself can be more robust in the auditing of things like favorable deals, the auditing of double binds, making sure that they're more selective in their hires to minimize the revolving door effect. This is how we get effective regulation.
What are the conclusions here? Firstly, auditing and regulating are unlikely to be cut, as opening opposition said, but instead likely to be scaled up in a way that allows us to unlock our benefits. And secondly, we're likely to get a good private market. I now want to explicitly compare what is good about the private market and why the failures of the government are endemic. Firstly, the government lacks information. They're very bad at aggregating this stuff because there's legislative limits such as data privacy laws that they self-audit on more than private firms can be audited on, especially because regulation is so smart and scale. Secondly, it is more short-termist than private industry because private industry needs to survive into the future continuously. While you only need your agency to do something to survive an electoral cycle, private companies who provide trades need to have consumer loyalty. They need to have shareholders, so their accountability is far more frequent in its operation. Secondly, there's far more acute accountability. Politicians never actually know why they were voted in and what issue they were voted in on, versus what basis were they voted on, what promises do they need to deliver. So accountability fails, and neither do the committees from opening opposition ever actually get audited, versus governments change frequently, and executives cannot be held to account directly because they were never voted in. However, shares can be sold off, debt can be reneged, private industry sticks around and is punished on its individual business decisions consistently, which means that the accountability that we get is far more acute compared to private industry. Third, private industry, governments do not market research because they have effective capture when they provide something like trains or like healthcare, whereas the private industry needs to try to win and over sectors, so they need to understand what the market needs and adjust, to innovate and invest where governments lack a strong and an incentive. And fourthly, they have less time and effort actually invested into this, because the marginal return for the government trying a little bit harder and making things better is very, very low. What are they actually going to gain from it? Versus competition amongst private businesses means that small differences on accessible or frequent services or cheap services makes a meaningful difference to how much you actually get in provision. So it is true that they will try harder. What are the potential sources of skepticism in this argument? Probably just that profiteering will strip back your services. Obviously governments do this too, but this claim is only true when many agencies mean that you fear government crackdowns, so you need to minimize costs to be resilient. Now, when you reduce that risk, you no longer have that strong incentive. I want to weigh this argument for you. Firstly, private industry matters more than efficiency because the government has inherent limitations which map onto government spending, which our arguments do not. But secondly, we are far more comparative than opening government by showing why we were uniquely good at addressing the failures of governments. The private market will solve where it has otherwise failed to do so because of the failures of governments. We're very proud of those.
I'd like to thank the member of government speaker and remind the House to make sure that they accept the URL because of their speech. We're now going to welcome the closing opposition team and the member of opposition speaker. Go ahead.
OGs run to the middle in this debate close the vast majority of their case. Conveniently, it also closed the vast majority of OO's case. In the vast majority of CG's case, we're going to explain why we win that comparative and why we're significantly better than any other team in this round. Their argument is pretty simple. They say we're going to absorb agencies into departments because there's high levels of overlap right now, and that overlap leads to losses of efficiency. The first contribution I'm going to make to this round is explain why overlap is unlikely, far better than the one-liner we get from OO, and therefore prove why this overlap means that on their side of the house you don't get significant efficiency gains. The second contribution I'm going to give to the round is explain why having these departments be these large Frankenstein departments is worse than having the system of constellation of agencies that we have right now, and why that system is actually better for efficiency in the government overall. The first thing I'm going to explain is why overlap is unlikely. OO notably makes some attempt at proving this argument in the DLO. They don't do it very well. So all Chris tells you is you don't want other departments to have the powers that you have, which is why you don't do overlap. Problems with this argument. Firstly, they never explain why the low-level bureaucrats who might be power-hungry or want to engage in bureaucratic empire building have the actual power to ensure that overlapping agencies don't happen. The problem with their argument is that they're misnaming the actor when they're rebutting OG, which means that the rebuttal here doesn't actually function. That is to say, OG's talking about politicians' incentives, whereas they talk about the incentives of bureaucrats, so they're not actually able to effectively rebut the argument. Why is overlap actually unlikely? Firstly, empirically, agencies are frequently set up for temporary periods of time. They do not last permanently. Frequently, these are limited in scope and limited in time and limited in size. Secondly, they are frequently checked back upon. So, for instance, you do things like the Government Accountability Office and the Comptroller frequently audit agencies, make sure that they are functioning to the necessary need, and they are able to shut down agencies if they're not functioning properly. Thirdly, you can do things like funding cuts on our side of the house. I think very frequently lawmakers defund an agency, and therefore they cannot operate even if they want to, which means that these agencies lose their power over time if they're not effective in their duties. Fourthly, I do think that central management does exist, and therefore the OG argument as to why overlap is likely or overlap is better the EPA reports directly to the head of the Department of Interior. So they're never actually able to prove a meaningful delta there. Fifthly, I think on our side of the House, overlap is unlikely because there are strong incentives for politicians to not want to engage in overlap. There are strong incentives in status quo to make sure that there's not bureaucratic fluff. Lawmakers are quite skeptical of the bureaucratic state. This is Weber's central argument if you've ever read anything about bureaucracy, and therefore I think it is highly unlikely they fund a ton of competing agencies because they want the maximal ability and power to dictate exactly the ways in which they deal with these states, deal with these agencies, which is why, for instance, Chevron became so important in doing these sorts of things. Why is this relevant? Firstly, I just don't think OG has a case. Like, I just genuinely do think that most of the arguments they make are like, we're going to cut money, but the way we cut money is by giving all of that money to these big pools of states. And I think OO is reasonably able to point out that things like HR departments are probably necessary, and the size and scope of the HR department that you have in a massive Frankenstein agency is far larger than the size of the HR agency that you have in these small areas. So I'm not sure that they're actually able to prove any meaningful efficiency claims, and all of the stuff they tell you about how you're able to coordinate across agencies, or coordinate across a department, can also happen when you coordinate across agencies. So they're never able to actually engage in the comparative and explain why the patchwork of agencies that happen now, which also centrally coordinate and manage, because they also talk to the other departments, is likely to be a flawed system. Secondly, I don't think that they're able to prove why, if there are cuts on their side of the House, they're likely to be bad. A couple of reasons as to why the ways in which these departments operate are likely to cause bad cuts to the government instead of good ones. The first thing is I think they're politically motivated. So they say we're not defending Trump and the Department of Governmental Efficiency. Fine, but they have to defend presidents doing this or politicians doing this generally, and we think the way in which this happens on their side of the House is always likely to be bad, because maybe it's not Trump all the time, but it's probably Republicans 50% of the time and Democrats 50% of the time. And so if you have constant shifts in funding that go to departments or go to these things, I think it's probably quite likely to be bad, particularly given that the kinds of things that you cut on their side of the House are likely to be the ones that have the least amounts of political will, least amounts of those things. Secondly, I think that there are likely to be cuts from the heads of agencies to particularly important agencies. So I would posit that some agencies need to be isolated from political movements in time. That is to say, it's probably really, really bad if Republicans defund NASA. We don't get space research then. Their comparative of putting it within, I don't know what department they put NASA into, but maybe they figure out a way to do it. It's just really, really bad. Firstly, because the head of that department doesn't know shit about how NASA operates. It's probably better for it to be a scientific person who knows all of those things. Secondly, I think we're far more likely to get intra-departmental cuts that are determined by people at the top, which is particularly bad because whatever that person prioritizes becomes the thing that is cut, rather than it being done through a general spending bill on our side of the House, which we think is significantly better as a solution. Before I continue on, I'll take a POI from either team.
Yeah. So your claim is if there was duplication, someone would have noticed and stopped it. It's not like an accident. Like having a whole new administrative structure for a whole different agency is part of the point of having a whole different agency. You said, why are you having your own HR department? They'd be like, well, of course we do. We're our own agency.
So if your argument is that the administrative structures that create agencies are bad, I think that falls prey to the OO argument, which is that administrative structures scale up in size. I just don't think this matters. If that's your only claim, you reduce the budget by like $1 million, which is probably the cost of these HR departments. You're not proving much of anything in this round. I think on the comparative, our side of the House is significantly better. Firstly, because we're able to prove why this overlap is unlikely, therefore taking you out. Secondly, we prove why these cuts are likely to be bad. Finally, what I'm going to prove is why the constellation of agencies is better. Firstly, because I think you get coordination across them, and that's better than coordination within them. You have separate individuals, separate personnel, separate talent that is able to come up with new ideas and new structures, because the initial authorities of these things comes from different people, which means that you get more collaboration in ways that are good, and not the kinds of groupthink that I think you get on your side of the House when you have the same boss all the time. Secondly, I think this patchwork is significantly better in terms of your ability to create the kinds of mandates that are necessary. So if you're significantly more specialized in your jobs and the things that you do on a day-to-day basis, rather than constantly coordinating across in the ways that they talk about, you're more likely to get these things done faster and more efficiently. You have a direct team to go to. They're far more likely to be subject to the political stuff we talk about.
defining speech. And I welcome the government because of the government that share it.
Respond to closing opposition, unlike them, because they didn't respond to us at all. One can say overlap is unlikely. I don't care. I'm not even going to contest it. This is completely unresponsive to our case. Perhaps responsive to opening government, even if the agencies overlap a little bit, even if they don't overlap so much, our claim is just that the fact that they are big is bad. We are making them smaller. This will need to respond. Second, they say, what if we defund NASA? That would be bad. No reason why that would be bad, because as we pointed out, there are obviously private alternatives to that, right? Like presumably, if you have far less money going towards NASA, then you will have far more power towards SpaceX, who will be able to, per the reasons that we gave, do space exploration in a way that will be more beneficial to people. So, I think all of the CO case is basically just O's case, but non-responsive to what we said. Why are these agencies actively harmful? Unlike opening government, we are not going to be soft. We're not going to be running around semantics about agencies and departments, around a soft case about efficacy and maybe a little bit more money is going to be saved. We gave you a nice old right-wing argument. Big state is bad. We want smaller state, which should be the obvious OG, but we actually run it from CG. So, first of all, the reasons why we go over opening government. One, we explain the far larger harm that opening government did in terms of what harm these agencies cause. That is to say, opening government, and we agree with them, explain that there are some inefficiencies that perhaps could be solved by shuffling. We explain that this crowds out private sector, denying growth, denying innovation, denying services to people that would be far more effective than bloated government agencies. Secondly, we are not dependent on the semantics, right? Like, if you think that agencies and departments are kind of similar, or if you think that opening government didn't really explain what the difference between them is, and one is more efficient than the other, good, because we don't rely on that, right? We are explaining that the size of the state is just bad. So, given that, why are these agencies actively bad in crowded private sector? We explained, number one, actually explained, unlike just gesturing with two words, why private sector has less access to borrowing trusting. Second, that the government is often picking winners, which means that they monopolize certain sectors, such as transportation, providing it instead of much better services such as Redline, or space exploration, to be provided by much better services such as SpaceX. And thirdly, we explain that agencies very often do regulation incredibly badly, right? You have capturing through revolving door effect, meaning that there are often the largest companies often demand regulations that are serving them as opposed to serving to the general growth of the economy. For example, making the barrier of entry for smaller businesses far larger because now they have to be complying with huge regulatory costs that the corrupt agencies are imposing upon them. So, because of that, private sector suffers through large agencies. If we are removing the money, they are far more likely, as Virgil explained, to do regulation less and regulation more effectively in the places where it matters more. I'm going to respond to opening opposition in terms of their analysis slightly clashing to ours. They say that there are accountability mechanisms. They say there are statutes about agencies bloating. Even if that's true, we say that they are already sufficiently bloated, they are already quite big, we would want to make them smaller. And second, they say there are a lot of legal ways to hold them accountable. What reasons? That was just a sentence in alone. Then they say bureaucrats answer to politicians. Politicians have electoral incentives, so they're going to be doing good things. First of all, lots of the examples that we are explaining are not necessarily something that voters do notice, or it's the voters' primary issue of caring. So if you have, for example, really inefficient transportation, sometimes it's not the thing that voters vote about, but it's still harming their quality of life and would have been preferable if the private sector was providing it. But secondly, often it's easy to blame it on the technocrats, so politicians are not necessarily accountable for the technocrats too. Second, they say states are holding federal agencies accountable. First, not always you have sufficient number of states that are going to be pushing against or pushing insufficiently. But secondly, often the same lobbying and the same regulatory capture by large companies is happening on the state level. So it's unclear why they will be effectively challenging the federal agencies. The final thing that opening opposition says here is this will be really bad because it's going to be a bad signal to investors. First, I think opening government is reasonable in that we wouldn't slash it tomorrow. But secondly, our case flips that, right? This is a positive signal to investors because now you are signaling you'll be removing terrible regulations. You're going to make the private sector better. So investors are going to be like, yay, sounds great. Now we can invest more into better and more efficient corporations. So that then explains why the agencies are bad, why the accountability mechanisms of opening opposition do not work. The final thing I want to do is to explain why the private sector is better. Before I do that,
Environmental damage and employee abuse are not costed into company balance sheets in the absence of agencies.
I will get to that, don't worry. So, why is the private sector better? The first thing is a strategic observation, which is that opening opposition or closing opposition never explains why the private sector is a worse alternative. They just go like politicians will be worse. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the alternative, right? I think like first of all, they correctly point out that legislation would often be slower, would be lesser, so probably politicians wouldn't do nearly as much of it. But secondly, I would note that like, even if the alternative to some extent might be politicians, we think not much, right? They are still much more accountable to voters. And often, like the issues that we identify with them, like lobbying, is far more likely to be spotted and observed and much more transparent than with unnamed technocrats. So, about opening opposition doesn't have anything to compare with private sector effectively. So, why is then the private sector better at providing services? The first thing we explain is that you are far more accountable to markets, which is like, all says bureaucrats are expert, but the problem is that even if they are experts, it doesn't solve for the problem of the sheer largeness of the operations that they need to be doing, right? Very often you do not collect the information that you should be collecting, you don't know what people want, what their struggles are, the large scale is just limiting you on that. So, the private sector is far better, given that due to the competition, due to the fact that you need to be responsive to markets, you do market research far better, you have far quicker feedback on what people want. Then the second thing they said is that you're far more likely to be long-term when you are a private company, right? Because as all concedes, often bureaucrats are accountable to politicians to some extent, so they're far more likely to be doing short-termist populist things, as opposed to companies who are at least looking towards the profits in the long term. And lastly, we also explained you have far less competition, so you have far less incentive to do good things. Note that opening opposition says very little about what are the actual really good things that these agencies do. They say climate regulations, and they say labor. The first thing is that climate regulations, often given the importance of it globally, that sometimes you are solved by regulations in other states where those companies want to be going. And secondly, like the fact that like fossil fuels, etc., are going to be finite is something that companies also take into account just on like the market level for themselves. But also like the most important vote-relevant things like horrible labor standards or like welfare are probably the things that will be cut the last because those are actually things that voters will be really angry about. So it's far more likely the efficiency is going to be taken at the better levels. For all those reasons, very proud of those.
I'd like to thank the government speaker for that fine speech, and I want the opposition to present the
All right, everyone ready? What do we bring you in this round? First, we take OG out of the round for good because we tell you that overlap is unlikely. What that means is that they have no argument, because if the only reason that consolidating all of these agencies into, by the way, also like everyone throughout the round points this out, that they're like, these agencies have all of these like bureaucratic pathologies, but all of a sudden when we combine them into larger departments, somehow the departments are going to be amazingly managed. Clearly that's not true, right? But we take them out of the round. And then also what we do is we show that the cuts specifically happen to bad areas, and what that means is that like the quality of public services is just impaired, and also that having a constellation of agencies is better for reasons that are more robust than what OO gives you. Okay, I want to take CG out of the round, and then we'll talk more about our contributions, okay? The first thing to observe is that they're bound by the OG comparative in this round, right? So when the OG goes up and talks about combining these things into departments that do the same things, you can't necessarily have this counterfactual of just getting private agencies, or sorry, like businesses to go and do all these things, right? But moreover, there's a really fundamental problem with your argument in this round, which is usually when the government does something, it's because the agencies don't have a profit incentive to do it, right? And so, like, you need to prove that that businesses will actually go in and do all of these things, right? Maybe you can say that the government can hire them as vendors, but we can also hire businesses as vendors. And also, like, businesses aren't getting paid that much to be government vendors because the government doesn't have that much taxpayer money. So like, I don't know how you even get your counterfactual. Moreover, it's actually better in our world. First, large departments are less bound by a specific purpose, which means that you get more regulatory overreach in your world, and that means less room for the private sector to step in. Second, agencies, as compared to departments, are smaller, and thus easier for the private sector to influence. And so if you think that private sector influence is good, that's actually a good thing on our side. But then third, there are more places to hide blame in a large department as opposed to agencies, which have a clearer hierarchy. So also, insofar as like the way that this debate probably plays out in the real world, is that the government hires vendors for like a lot of different things in either world. Like at least in our world, you have smaller agencies that are dealing with these vendor contracts, and you have clearer delegation of authority and hierarchy among people within the agency. Whereas when you have bids being evaluated by these large departments, that process doesn't necessarily go as well. Okay, so why do we prove to you that the cuts specifically happen to areas where they're detrimental, right? We tell you that there are going to be constant political shifts in priorities. So the Republicans are going to come into office and cut like education and like the EPA and all of that for 4 years. And then you're going to have Democrats come in and cut like the military and all the defense agencies. And so you're going to get this constant whiplash in their world that we think is bad. Even if they're only talking about reorganization, still, we think that constant reorganization is probably a bad thing. Also, we tell you that usually there are incentives to cut things that are good in the short term, that are bad in the short term but good in the long term, right? So like having natural disaster preparedness or having people who are like experts on like infectious diseases, right? Like they look like they're just sitting around and doing research or like on a government payroll, and they're not that useful right now, but they're really important over the long term. And we think that it's likely that it's these functions that get lost in the shuffle when agencies are being recombined into larger departments. Also, I think that this constellation of agencies is better, not only because of what Naz tells you about how you have new ideas and structures, which is also specifically why the intelligence community in the US tries to have multiple agencies work on one issue. They're doing the weighing for you that they think that the new ideas are more important than the duplication, and because they're more specialized on the day-to-day. And that's specifically important because the federal government addresses uniquely complicated issues because of the 50-state context of what they have to deal with, and also the fact that they're dealing with like frontier issues like emerging technology policy, also the entitlement system is extremely complicated with the fact that you have all sorts of different public-private partnerships and interactions with state and local governments. So you need having this this specialized expertise, and you get that more in our world with specialized agencies as opposed to these mammoth departments where there's less accountability and where you're less likely to retain experts. Sure, I'll take you closing. Closing?
This is not a fiat-based motion, so we can legitimately support an alternative, but it is when you reduce the debt cost so you can sustainably enter areas that would otherwise be unprofitable, you create the problem that we have solved.
Okay, first off, you're still bound by your OG's modeling. They have modeling power in this round, so for you to go in and then say, no, actually, we're gonna cut them and not recombine them and use the money, that's just a different advocacy, right? But moreover, I think that it is just clear that the comparative in this round that all teams agree to is constellation of more specialized agencies versus fewer, smaller, larger agencies that have broader functions. No, I've taken a POI. Okay, so the other thing too is I think that when we have more different agencies, in addition to getting better policy on these complicated and impactful topics, I also think that accountability is just a lot easier, right? It's easier to measure the effectiveness of separate agencies that you can call out versus separate departments within a larger agency, department that now have different middle managers that all interact with each other, and they have liaisons within the department, and it's just much more difficult when it's all entangled into one thing versus when you can separate them out, right? Okay, so let's now deal with the different teams in this round. Okay, I'm getting to you, OG, but I'm not going to take your POI, sorry. Okay, so again, the big problem with OG in this round is that
last chance we did.
No. Larger departments need more internal bureaucracy, right? Look at a startup versus look at a big company, right? The big company probably has 4 like layers and middle managers, and like the goals of the CEO get translated down the line into like a form that's kind of unintelligible because each layer of the corporate bureaucracy has principal agent problems and is dealing with like all of this like Kafka-esque stuff, right? They're the ones who create the larger departments. All of the pathologies are worse in their world. So yeah, sorry, you guys are out of line. Okay, now, you guys like say some things that are true, but you also say some things that are untrue, right? So you talk about accountability, but also what I think your accountability looks like is just putting agencies on a shorter leash, which means less of the sort of innovation and less like agency creativity that we think is good. Like the median bureaucrat actually like wants to do a good job, but is constrained by government bureaucracy. Also, your investor consistency point is silly because there's no more consistency. Yeah, okay, you guys realize that. Okay, and then CG, you guys, like, I just think that your private sector counterfactual is like incredibly underproven. Like our company's really gonna go in and like run the transportation infrastructure. We also hold companies to account better and can do this better in our world. So proud of you.
Thank you all for the advice. Debate, the board, shake hands.